So today we'll be working on a ink and watercolor of a sunflower. When you're drawing your sunflower, one thing to think about is with your petals, it's really easy to kind of get overwhelmed with all of those. So a lot of times I'll draw a circle for the middle and then another circle kind of for the radius of how many petals and how far I want them to go, because it's really easy to get petals kind of out of sync. And then when you're drawing them individually, make sure you don't make them too pointed because most petals, are very nice and soft and fragile. So you want to make sure that, they do have a good tip, but they're not too pointy, or else they'll look more like a succulent or a cactus. So be careful of that. So I already have my sunflower drawn on, just kind of a general outline. I haven't drawn every single, little dot on there. That's more what I'm going to do with ink. I have drawn most of my petals on there, but if a new one comes up, that's totally fine. Or you can always sometimes change your drawing and add an extra one or get rid of the one that doesn't make sense. So now what I'm going to do is start kind of outlining my drawing, since I already have it transferred onto my Arches watercolor paper. So I'm just using an 02 micron just to kind of start outlining, some of my petal lines. And then when I'm outlining these and I run into a really, really pointy edge, sometimes you can go over that edge again to smooth it out. So, and then I'll go over each of these little petals, my leaves. So now that I have that outlined, what I'm going to start now is kind of adding some of the shading. So on kind of the stem of the sunflower, a really great technique to use is hatching, which if you use it very, very limitedly, it looks great and is good subtle shading. If you use too much of it, then it tends to look like hair. We don't really want a hairy sunflower. But you can always kind of overlap your lines to get some more shading, so it's always good to start with just a few because you can always add more later. So I'm going to put a little bit of shading underneath each of my leaves. And that's going to give a sense of how the leaves are on top of the stems. So, and then I'll add just a little bit of texture onto the leaves themselves, which sometimes the texture on there can be just replicating the same lines over and over again, or just kind of following kind of the grooves of some of our veins on the leaves. I'll add some hatching on each of the petals. And when you're adding your shading on here, you really want to pay attention to where all of your shadows are and highlights. Like a lot of the sunflowers have some really nice, pretty highlights that you don't want to lose, because that's really going to make that sunflower petal look nice and curved. So it's good to start with less because you can always add more. So that's how I'd go about this shading. And then of course I would finish the whole entire petals with that kind of shading. And then for the center, it's more of either scribbling or stippling. So for the center, I'm just going to start by just kind of doing a few little curvy lines to kind of replicate the kind of texture that's in the sunflower. And you really want to pay attention to your reference picture and try and see where it's darker and where it's lighter, because some sunflowers actually get darker as they go into the center, and a lot of times they'll have kind of a nice dark ring around them for where, you know, the center is. You can also mix it up and add some scribbling, which scribbling is kind of like very, very tight swirls almost, which is really good for filling empty areas. Or you can just stick with tiny dots for your stippling, but it's always fun to experiment. So now that we have our ink done for our sunflower, what we want to work on next is layering in some of our watercolor. So I'm going to start with first kind of a cadmium yellow, which is a nice bright yellow. And I'm just going to go over each of my petals just with a nice light wash. You know, and if ever an area got too yellow, like you used too much paint in that area, a lot of times what you can do is just take your paintbrush and lift, or if you don't mind it, you can always leave it and just make the others just as bright later on. So once I have that nice light wash, what I'm going to do is come in and look for any of the shadows in my reference picture. So if you look at the petals of a sunflower, you can kind of see where there's a nice light yellow, then there's some nice shadows, and then a little bit of an orangey color in there. So I'm going to take that same yellow with just a little less water, and I'm just going to go over kind of my shadow sections. And my other yellow is still a little wet, not sopping wet, but it's a little wet. And then I can take that same yellow and add a little bit of orange to it if you have an orange, or you can add just a really small amount of like a cadmium red. And I'm going to put that at the very ends of each of my petals. And as you're doing this, try and think about the direction that each of these petals are going. Because if you do them too quickly, then they're all just going to kind of blend together and become one flower. Well, one petal. So while that's drying, I'm going to do some layers on the center of my flower, which I'm going to start off first with actually taking some yellow and laying that over my entire little circle. Because if you look at a sunflower, actually they have little bits of yellow. It's not just empty brown. And then I'll take a little bit of burnt sienna, which is a nice reddish brown, and fill that center. And while that's drying, I'm going to take some sap green with a little bit of yellow. I'm going to start kind of coating the whole entire stem and my leaves. But be careful if some of your petals are on top of any leaves, because you don't want these to kind of seep together. And then I can come in with a little more sap green I'll add a little Payne's gray to make it a little bit darker. And I'm going to put a little bit of that darker green, which, whoops, it's still a little too watery. So I'm going to take kind of this shadowy green color, and just put it in the areas that are really dark. And of course, if you mess up and get where you don't want it to be, you just take a slightly wet brush, lift it off, and there you have it. And it's not so messy. So I might also darken kind of the tips of some of these leaves, which if your other green is already dry, sometimes how you can blend it into there is just taking a little bit of water and kind of dragging it into that color. And then now I'm going to take that cadmium yellow again and just do another coat on some of my petals, but I still want to try and keep some of that light yellow going, just because that's going to be kind of the highlight on the tips of our petals. So don't go crazy when you're doing your next layer. We still want to keep those highlights. I'm going to put in a little bit more yellow in this area. A little bit more orange. Especially in those shadows. So, and then, just to get that middle nice and dark, I'm going to be taking some Van Dyke brown, which is a really nice dark brown, and I'm going to mix it with a little bit of sap green, and I'm going to fill in the middle. And to get it to stay nice and dark, what you want to make sure and do is not grab too much water or touch it too much. And then as I'm working, you have to make sure not to lose too much of those little yellow peaks that are in here. Over time, I'll do more and more layers of that dark brown. And to make my dark brown even darker, I can add a little Payne's gray to it. And I'm just kind of pecking in some little more darks. And maybe I'll put a little bit in some of my shadows, just to some of those far away petals, because you don't want all of your petals to look exactly the same, or else, you know, it looks man-made. And then since these aren't too wet, I can go ahead and put a light background color into my background, which I kind of like the look of a blue sky. So I'm going to work on that. There you have it. Now I have my sunflower with a nice little background. And then if ever you have little outlines around there, you can always just take a wet brush and smooth those out. or sometimes it's fun to leave them to have a little bit of variety. And then the last thing I would do is just darken the center with a couple bits more of your Van Dyke brown just to make that a little more interesting. You could always do more layers on your leaves.